Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Composer's Cut podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Arreguin. I'm a composer and cellist, and in this podcast, I'm going to be interviewing composers and performers of contemporary music. I really love to hear how composers differ on their compositional process so that we can all learn from each other and continue to refine our own approach to creating music. I'm really excited for this episode's guest. I'm going to be chatting with composer Anna-Louise Walton, who I met back in 2016 at the Vipa Festival in Spain. Anna's music has been performed all over the world by many respected ensembles, from chamber groups to vocal groups to orchestral ensembles. She recently completed her doctoral degree at Columbia University. In this conversation, we get into Anna's compositional process, her fascination with objects, where ideas come from, how she goes about developing her materials. I'm really excited to be sharing this with you. If you're not familiar with Anna's music, please do yourself the favor and go check out her work. You can find it on her website or on YouTube. I'll leave some links in the description below. Feel free to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, leave a comment below. Let's jump right in. So I remember the first time that I encountered your music was in 2016 at Vipa Festival in Spain, and the piece was played by Switch Ensemble on the same concert as mine, actually, but mine was like a solo alto saxophone and fixed media that Phil Purick premiered. And I remember that when I heard that piece, which I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation. I don't actually, maybe you can pronounce the title because.
I'll also butcher it because I don't speak Icelandic. I need my friend Fiola Evans here, who's an Icelandic composer, but it's like Yoko Sarlon or
Okay,
something
that's kind
like
of what I
that.
thought.
I'm
Like
sure it's butchered, but
I was gonna, I was gonna make it more like quasi Spanish, like Yoku Sarlon, something like that. I don't know if that's closer or further,
I,
but
I also couldn't tell you to be honest.
what does the title mean?
So it is a place that I visited in Iceland, and it is like a glacial lagoon. And so there's these massive, ice,
Yeah.
obviously. And it's very, very quietly moving and shifting. And so you get all these, like, it was one of the most incredible things I've ever heard in my entire life. Like, I remember, and it was also like not very many people were there because I was there in like off season. It was like maybe November or something. So it was super quiet, just this like open landscape, and then just these like little cracks and hisses coming from the ice, and it was just like totally amazing. So that was kind of, what I was trying to evoke in the piece. So
Yeah, I mean, I can't believe it's almost been 10 years since that performance because the majority of the pieces that I heard are in that, I don't know if it was 1 week or 2 weeks or however long it was, but I feel like I don't remember almost any of them. But that one specifically has always stuck in my memory. And I feel like it's like the very intricate and delicate sound world that you created. And I remember like the shot glasses that the percussionist was supposed to use being like really important. And now that you're mentioning like the crackling, quiet, delicate sounds of these, I guess, glaciers, makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
So yeah, I feel that your approach to timbre is amazing. I noticed like it seems like there are these like wormholes between the instruments that you're able to create to I don't know, guide the ear in these like timbre melodies. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to timbre?
Yeah. So I think that in that piece and other pieces as well, I try to work with a restricted amount of material. I think I tend to try to dig in, if that makes sense, to kind of like a little corner, or kind of carve out a small space is like how I think
Totally.
about my music. Um, and it helps me to do that with kind of limiting the material in a way. And so there aren't usually a ton of pitches. The pitch content is usually limited. And for me, it's very much, it's going back to Klangfarben melody and this kind of idea, but I think like the pitch and the timbre is one and the same. So I've never been able to compose with reductions or harmonic plans or anything like that. I really just compose the little cells, of music as they are because I can't really separate one from the other. Um, yeah, so I'm really focused on, and then thinking of, a really high pitched kind of sine wave like, timbre, and then, mixing that with, for example, a noisy timbre, which I really do think of as, you know, a very broad pitch, a thick pitch kind of event. So it's really organizing those together with rhythm into these little cells, miniature cells, and then I kind of expand out. So for me, the approach to timbre is kind of one and the same as the approach to composing in general, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I feel that specifically like strange or unique timbres seem to attract you in your music because I have noticed like a through line is like I don't know a fascination with objects like the shot glasses or like in Flex these like very particular like plastic percussion mallets which we can talk about in a little bit. But yeah, what is your relationship with objects and do you tend to like notice an interesting sound in an object and then think, oh, I wonder what this would sound like in a piece? Or is it like you have a piece idea and you try to find the object? Or does it sometimes happen in both ways?
No, I would say it definitely happens that I hear a sound and then that sound inspires a lot of the time the piece. So I think a lot of the time, actually, the title or the kind of quote unquote, the program note or whatever it might be usually comes after the music. So I named the piece Yokel Sarlon after I actually had started composing it. So the shot glass was important, this really like high pitched, glassy kind of like succinct sound that then gets imitated and kind of thrown between the instruments. Same with Flex, that I was just really kind of obsessed with this, bouncing of the mallet on the table, and that kind of that's a timbre, but it's also rhythmic and kind of a gesture, I guess you could say. But I get really, infatuated almost with the sound, and then that is kind of the seed of where the music comes from.
Does this ever happen when you're around other people and they notice that you're suddenly focused on like a really particular sound or like, oh no, Anna's at it again?
Probably, especially of my family, I think they like
Yeah.
know, but I guess most of the people that I spend a lot of time with, my partner's a composer and my family knows me well. So it's, at the point where like, okay, yeah, that was like a cool sound coming from a straw or whatever. And you kind of like save. I feel like most composers kind of are like have a little bank of sounds that we're like saving, that might be useful. You might figure out a way to use it in a piece later.
Yeah, I feel like that happens to me too. Like, especially when we're at like thrift stores or I don't know, secondhand stores, and they're just like a bunch of different shapes or sizes of or thicknesses of glass or ceramic, and I start just like flicking things
Yeah, classic.
because I'm just
Yeah.
like curious about how it might sound, and
Just
then
a little
yeah,
tap with the knuckle or like, I've like taken even like mallets into Walmart before, and just like listening to different bowl sounds and this is like a thing that we all have done at some point, I think. But it's very cool because it it teaches you to notice and listen more, which is like a very cool gift that I think I've gotten from being a composer, where you're like walking along and you hear something really spectacular and it like totally stops you in your tracks, and you're like just really present in that moment listening to something. And that's a very cool thing that maybe I always had that in me to a certain extent, but I think you practice it more when you're,
yeah,
actively composing.
it gets more nurtured.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that even with like traditional kind of approaches to I don't know how classical musicians approach music with like major thirds, triads and stuff, like they don't realize, especially with the piano, how out of tune it is and how amazing it sounds because it's out of tune.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
certain chords, like if you play like widely spaced chords that are like an I don't know, particular voicing of triad, the major third is obviously going to be super sharp, but they may not notice that on the surface, but for I guess us that we've practiced this I don't know, habit of listening deeply and listening to a lot of different kinds of music, it's just like, yeah, a completely different experience. And when you point it out to them, they're like, it's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, it is. And that's something you learn a lot. I sang in choirs for my whole life, and you learn that a lot in choir. I remember in college being in chamber choir and you like learn, oh, actually, the minor third and the major third, need to be tuned differently than how they are. You need to relax it or you need to raise it depending on on the interval. But yeah, you learn how kind of big of a space that minor second can be by singing, I think, especially in a choir.
Or if you're a string player, like when I was
Right.
in high
Also.
school, I used to just assume, oh, the half steps are all the same, so you just put your fingers where they're supposed to go. But then in college, I would play like that, and my teacher would be like, your E is sharp. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's in the right spot.
Right. Look,
So
I have a
yeah.
piano to show you. No. Yeah, completely.
Yeah, so that was kind of like a mind shift for me, and yeah, I think I didn't have that quality at the time that you may have potentially had, so I had to sort of develop that. And I think the first time that I heard like a Sciarrino piece too, like I hated it, which is funny
Yeah.
because now he's one
Yeah,
of my
I
favorite
yeah.
composers. It's weird how you have to like crack open what you
Yeah, you
think
need
music can be,
exposure almost, like kids need to be exposed to food, or it's like this
right?
kind of thing where it's hard to explain to people who aren't into new music, like why I like the new music. It's like I just like it. I just genuinely like it. I like listening to it. It's not like some kind of like theoretical trip or anything. It's like I actually just enjoy it. So it's funny how
Right.
that works.
So going back to this idea of like not being able to separate pitch from timbre, when you're composing with these very reduced materials, how do you think about variations and how do you move through, I don't know, different kinds of forms with very, very reduced materials?
Um, I mean, some of it's just like kind of basic composition exercises that I try to go back to, like what are 5 different ways that I could do this, and really trying to this is something I've been consciously also trying to develop in my own work. Um, staying with an idea for longer. Also, it has a lot to do with timing, I think. And it's so incredibly difficult. Like it's just it's like trying to hold a cloud or something. Like you can't ever quite get a grasp of how time will feel in different situations and figuring out how long an idea needs, before it needs to change or be developed, or maybe you can sit with it longer is something that I still spend a lot of time thinking about with every piece. So that also has to do with, kind of quote unquote developing material or changing material is also how long does that material need to just sit and be. Um, so that's something I'm really working on. I think a lot of times, I think, in the concert, like, oh, that actually could have, I could have stayed there for longer. And so I really try to think about that when I'm composing. But with working with limited material, it forces you. I mean, it's not that I don't even have strict rules. I think intuitively I work with limited material because I think that I focus a lot on details as a listener. I think that we're all composing for how we listen.
Mm.
We're composing for ourselves ultimately, I think. Art kind of has to be selfish in that way if it's going to have some kind of voice. I think that makes any sense. So I'm a very detailed listener. I don't necessarily, the big grandiose forms, while I can sit down and analyze, a Beethoven sonata or whatever. Um, that's not the thing that always impacts me as much as like a really small moment, tend to be my favorite moments, or the moments that I find really moving are usually just really small things. And so I think that's how I compose. So I'm drawn by focusing on details. It kind of makes it natural, I think, or inherent for me to limit the material because I'm focused on, making very small rhythmic changes, or making small timbral changes, and the result is material that tends to be limited. So it's actually not a thing that I go into with rules. It's just
Right.
kind of my intuition leads me to restrict the material, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So there were a lot of things that you said that I'm kind of interested in sort of digging deeper into. One is like this idea of time and figuring out how long something is supposed to last. Is the feedback loop for you like when you finish the piece and hear the premiere, you realize it should have been longer, or are you also like mocking up with your own sort of like homemade recordings to try to gauge how something should last?
It's both. I do both. I mean, I do make mock-ups a lot, but even with a mock-up, it's like time is not the same in all situations and all
Yeah.
moods and all modes of listening. And it's very strange time. So sometimes it will work in the mock-up, but then in the performance, you think, oh, this section could have been twice as long, and I could have like sat listening to it more. Or it could be the opposite, but I haven't, I've, I mean, I've personally thought about that about some music I've heard in concerts. Like this could have been shorter, and I haven't. Maybe I need to keep pushing until I think that about my own music, or maybe none of us. It's also very possible none of us ever think that about our own music because we think we're maybe a little bit more interesting than we are. But um, but yeah. So it's like this fluid thing, where time feels
Yeah.
different depending on the space and also just like your mood and whatever
Right.
else.
Or how distracted you are, because it could be
Right.
that, I mean, this happens to me too when I'm composing. Like one day I will feel pretty confident that the rhythms are the way that they should, and then the next day I'll kind of like sit and try again, and the rhythms are just like all completely wrong. And so it's you're right, it is a very sort of fluid thing that is constantly in flux, and it's I guess just a way to trap a kind of moment, but that's not maybe the only way that moment can exist. Especially if
Yeah.
it's like very reduced materials, because then it feels almost like a living thing, and it's like a
Yeah.
photograph of that living thing in a weird way.
Yeah, totally. I think it can be helpful. It's different than a mock-up is to try to sit with a stopwatch and sing it. No matter what the instrumentation is, but if you can just kind of sing the rhythm and like try to feel it, I think that can also be another approach to try to like feel time in like more in your body than like passive listening?
Although I find that sometimes for me, it's hard to listen and play at the same time. I feel like
Right.
I'm practicing like with a different part of my brain and listening with a different part of my brain. It's like I put my performer hat on and I take the composer hat off a little bit. And
Right.
so I feel like there's no perfect way for me at least to trap down what the right rhythms are sometimes. Sometimes it's really obvious to me what the rhythms should be, and like every time I listen to it, it's like roughly, not always exactly the same, but like roughly the same durations. So,
Yeah.
and it also depends on what else is around it, because
Yeah, of course.
sometimes like something can in isolation be played for a really long time, but once you combine it with other elements, the amount of time that it needs also changes. So it's this
Mhm.
really strange sort of constantly moving choreography.
Yeah, totally.
So I was also thinking about this piece Bliss because I listened to this piece last night, and a lot of what you're talking about is reminding me of that piece. What was the process like for that piece? Because I feel like you were thinking of like, I don't know, composition exercises that were probably more than five things in the list, maybe like 30 or 40 things, like long gliss, short gliss, high gliss, low gliss, whistle gliss, instrument gliss, woodwind gliss. It's almost like a Dr. Seuss book.
Yeah, that's a great characterization actually, because I think it's a very kind of fun, lighthearted piece, and kind of childish actually. I think the sounds are a little bit childish. Um, well, that one, again, I would say all of my work has in common kind of like a little infatuation. It starts with some kind of sonic infatuation on my part. And in this piece, well, in general, I just have a thing for glissandos because we all have things that we like,
Yeah.
as composers, and we keep going back to, and I just like them for some reason. Um, but so I had a workshop with the ensemble Proton Baron, who are wonderful performers, and so I asked the bassoon player to do I just, I had a recorder with me and I just said, just do like a really long glissando. And she did this glissando over the entire range
Oh
of
my
the
gosh.
bassoon. And it was like really slow and it sounded incredible. Like it like totally blew me away because it was so strange, because it was slow and all of the adaptations that she had to do to glissando over the different registers of this like instrument with a really large range. It had like the timbre was so alive and it was always moving, and sometimes it sounded very silly, and so that was the thing that started that whole piece that I said, okay, this is going to be the basis. And so the idea kind of that piece is not just glissandos, but it's a focus on the woodwinds actually doing a glissando because they're not meant to glissando,
Right.
basically. So it works really well, as you know, on the cello. It's very fluid, and it's exactly because it's uncomfortable and a little, vulnerable, and they really, you never quite know when the instrument will break with a woodwind. Um, and so that's what makes it timbrally interesting, I think. So that was the focus of the piece, is actually highlighting the woodwind instruments instead of the strings. The strings are really supporting most of the glissandos in that piece. And then and then as you said, I extended it out. I made even artificial glissandos by doing a quarter, uh, a keyboard in quarter tones that would, glissando down. And then I even tried to expand it. So actually formally there's glissandos where the entire ensemble is kind of a meta instrument and they're sweeping up and down in pitch. So really making a glissando as small as it can be, and then really expanding it to this ensemble-wide formal kind of structure.
Right. I sort of heard that in on many different dimensions, but like especially from like starting in a high register and sort of like moving gradually over a long period of time to the low register and having low glissandi and low instruments like bass clarinet and bassoon and cello. But it's interesting too, like what you're talking about, the like you never know when a woodwind is gonna break, because it's almost like by having harp and quarter tone piano, it normalizes breaks because like those
Right,
instruments are not very good at I mean a piano can't glissando
right,
unless you use like a battery on the inside of the or something like that. But that would be
right.
really complicated in this context. So yeah, and I guess the harp can sort of do it if you like lift up the pedals, right?
It can do it a little bit, but actually, the thing about the pedal is it kind of, which I learned in the process with the harpist, is that it will kind of break. Like it's more for like kind of a portamento between a half tone and not really like it can't spend a lot of time in the middle
Right.
actually. So she actually used metal like a turnkey or another instrument, and that's kind of easier way to do it physically on the string.
Got it. So just
Um,
manually changing the tension of the string.
Yes.
Got it.
No, like
Oh,
changing like a slide on a guitar,
I
kind
see.
of
Yeah,
like a metal slide. So
I
it's like
see.
again very limited where it can work. But yeah, the piano and the harp obviously like punctuate, they're percussive in that sense. Um, yeah. So kind of orchestrating that all together. And then the piano has the melting piano part where I artificially, glissando, pitch shift some of the notes down as well.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess you also, in some cases, orchestrated like very close pitches with those instruments like the piano so that you fill the gaps somehow. So there's
Right.
still some kind of like glue in a way to
Right.
create the glissando. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I felt
Yeah.
that piece was like a masterclass in composition and what you could do with like one idea, a glissando, like glissando up, glissando down. How big are the glissandi? Are they really small? Are they really big? Are they really high? Are they really low? Are they really long? Are they really short?
Right.
Are
Oh,
all of
thank
them playing like in unison? Are they all playing
Right.
separately? So that it's all of these different variables that you were able to sort of like distribute across the piece to keep this one thing alive for a really long time. And I felt like that was yeah, it's such a learning experience for me as a listener, just remembering how you can reduce to the most, you know, minuscule thing that almost seems like on the surface inconsequential. And those are the
Mm.
kinds of pieces that impact me the most
Oh,
because it's like these little tiny things
well,
that
thank
are
you.
made the most special. So
That was also just a fun piece, like because I think the character, of the original glissando and just in general, I don't quite understand why, but it's kind of like a funny sound. So there's no jokes in the piece per se. It's not, like course, there's lots of humorous music, and this isn't really humorous,
Right.
but some people in the premiere laughed a little bit, and I was so, pleased with that because it really felt like just very fun, which is kind of like refreshing.
Totally, because I feel like, especially in new music concert halls, it's always like so serious,
Yeah.
and the pieces are
Except
all
for like the
so
Simon Steen Anderson piece, and then you can like laugh, but
dancing pianos and
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it, and I actually think about that concept of humor in music a lot. I feel like it's not really, weirdly, it's not mainstream to be humorous in music. I feel like there was
Yeah,
a lot of humor in music in previous decades, and like you listen to the Beatles, and a lot of their songs are just like kind of funny jokes, and
right,
like I don't know, Maxwell Silver Hammer or
right.
Rocky Raccoon. Is that what it's called? Rocky Raccoon? Can't remember.
I don't know what.
Maybe I'm mixing two things. I think I'm thinking of like Guardians of the Galaxy and
Oh,
at the same. I feel like it is Rocky Raccoon. Yeah, I'm gonna
from
have to from the song like
from
Rocky
Maxwell
Raccoon.
Davies.
No, it's a no, it's a Beatles song from the White Album.
Oh, oh, I can't. I
It's like
couldn't.
somewhere in the Black Hills down in the South Dakota, there lived a man named Rocky Raccoon, and one
I mean,
day
that
his
sounds
woman ran
right.
out. Yeah,
That sounds
I
right.
think that's what it's called. Anyway, this is a
They have a lot
parentheses
of
there.
like, yeah, they have a lot of
Yeah,
funny. I mean, there's like, kind of Natasha Deal's like, style, but a lot of that humor I feel like is brought in with, video or like text or like kind of things are added and they're a bit more like jokes,
yeah,
but it's not necessarily just like music itself, kind of, or the
right.
song itself being like having humor. I feel like that's a little bit, I don't know, maybe like Liggity has some pieces that are just,
That's true.
but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's maybe at a point in their careers when they've already done all the like the serious stuff, quote unquote.
Yeah, and then they're like, okay, screw it. I'm just gonna have this woman make a bunch of like funny sounds, like opera singing, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess that's pretty much all the questions that I had for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. This was really fun.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's really nice to talk with you.